Hello, and a very warm welcome from all of us here at UK Changing Europe to this, our very first Ask the Experts lunch hour. I'm Dr. Joelle Grogan. I'm head of research and the team here at the UKICE, and we're very, very excited for you to join us today. Before we jump into all the big questions of what's happened over the course of the last year and what even our expectations for the next year will be, let me first introduce our fantastic research team. I'm joined by Joël Reland, who leads on our UK-EU relations, our Brexit opportunities, and our regulatory divergence, by Sophie Stowers, who's going to be talking to us about UK politics and public opinion, by also Stephen Hunsaker, who's talking all about trade and economics and answering all your questions about inflation, and by Jannike Wachowiak, who leads on our EU and UK relations, and also bilateral relations. So lots of areas of expertise covered. Before we jump into the big topics of the last 12 months, let me first remind everyone out there listening live that you can and should ask questions via Slido. If you're watching on YouTube, the link is right below you. But let's kick off. Let's stay in the moment and reflect on where we're at right now. So we often talk about how fast things have been moving, especially UK politics over the last couple of weeks. But first question to all of the team, what event in your area over the last 12 months are we actually still going to be talking about in the next 12 months? Let's start off with Joelle. What do we think?
Okay, well, I'll begin my answer by apologising to Jannike because I suspect I may be giving the same answer as her, which is in UK-EU relations. I think the Windsor framework is kind of really a defining moment, and a moment which will continue to define relations for some time to come, because if we think about where UK-EU relations were a year ago, they were fundamentally stuck. No progress is being made on anything really because of the impasse over the Northern Ireland Protocol. And now that that has been unlocked, so to speak, there are still issues which need to be worked through around the Windsor framework, but broadly speaking, it has smoothed out political relations. That means you can start to have conversations that you couldn't have previously, and that sets a totally different context on the dynamic between the two countries. You only have to look at James Cleverly's speech yesterday that he gave to the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, where he said, more or less, I'm paraphrasing, but, we are constructive partners who want to work together. And where we have differences, they are things that we can overcome, not things that, have to push us apart. So it's a normalization of that relationship, if you like. And that's something that we haven't had for a long time in UK relations. So that's why I think it will continue to define kind of a new era in the relationship.
Well, Jannike, do we have agreement or a controversial opinion on the state of the relationship?
Yeah, no surprise there. I agree with Joelle that the Windsor framework was probably the most significant moment for EU-UK relations in the past 12 months. I think going forward, the focus will now be on implementation. So the EU in particular have said they will be looking for proper and full implementation of the Windsor framework, which will be in stages up until 2025. So I think the focus will now be on that. If I had to choose something else rather than the Windsor framework, and looking a bit outside of the UK and more towards the EU, I would probably say the European Council Summit last year in June, at which EU leaders decided to grant candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, which I think in the current kind of geopolitical climate was a very significant moment and is going to shape European politics and how the EU and its institutions look for years to come.
That's certainly true, and I know that we're going to be diving more into that EU-UK relationship later on. But Sophie, let's think back in the UK. What's your moment of the last 12 months that we'll still be talking about in 12?
I think so much has happened that it's hard to really sort of single it down to one particular moment. But as someone who's sort of quite interested in UK politics and public opinion, and particularly as we've got an election coming up, I would probably go for something quite recent, which is the resignation of several Tory MPs in the last few weeks, which is going to cause by-elections in the next few months. Just because I think really as we enter an election period, in the UK, how Rishi Sunak's party performs, and those will really, I think, give us a signal of what we can expect from the election next year. And I think it'll be seen as sort of a really important moment in how the Tory party sort of begins to formulate its electoral strategy as we approach 2024, really. And I think we'll be able to sort of trace it all back to the results of these by-elections that will come in the next few months.
So 3 very key events that no doubt we will be talking about over the next 12 months. But Stephen, what's yours before we dive into UK politics?
Yeah, I would definitely say that inflation is not something that we will is going to be going away in the next 12 months. We are still going to be seeing the effects of it, especially as the Bank of England tries to get down to its 2%. And, Rishi Sunak gets his goal of, having inflation by the end of the year. And so this is going to be something that's going to be on the minds of politicians and economists and the public as well, as we start to already see the effects on mortgages.
That promise of having inflation was certainly one of the key goals of Rishi Sunak in this year of 3 prime ministers. But Sophie, where the Conservative Party at right now in the polls? What do you see?
So Labour has a pretty consistent poll over consistent lead over the Conservatives in the poll, over the last sort of more than a year, probably 18 months now. I think the latest poll from Redfield and Wilton that came out today put them at an 18% lead over the Conservatives, I believe. So, they're in a pretty difficult place electorally. But I think the really significant thing about, there being so much change in the leadership of not just the country, but the Conservative Party in the last, year, is that it really crystallises how divided that party is. This is as a result, I think, mainly of that very sort of broad electoral coalition that Boris Johnson managed to build in 2019. But realistically, the one thing that really did unite that coalition was Brexit. And we've seen that becoming decreasingly important to the electorate over the last year, particularly as things, as they're unable to pay for, basic goods, the cost of living crisis, it's becoming less and less important. What that means is that coalition, there's nothing to hold it together. These are a group of voters with very different, values, economic preferences. It's very difficult to unite them in one singular policy in the way that Boris Johnson did, essentially. And I think by seeing the shift through the 3 prime ministers, we've kind of seen the 3 sort of elements to the Conservative Party, if you will. You've got that very sort of radical growth first coalition of Liz Truss. You've got a bit more maybe a technocratic, maybe more traditional Conservative Party that's embodied by Rishi Sunak. And then you've got those people who lent their votes to the Conservative Party maybe for the first time in 2019, which are generally, more liberal on welfare, on tackling inequality, but maybe somewhat more socially conservative, which is sort of embodied by Boris Johnson. And I think those sort of transition through those 3 prime ministers in the last years really showed just how divided that Conservative Party is, and why it will be so difficult for them at the next election to put forward kind of one united front.
I'm seeing Slido already lighting up, including by some of my favorite people. So hello out there. But some of the questions are pushing towards, well, is Brexit just no longer an issue? And one question is asking, well, how should Brexit be played, if at all, by either the Labour Party or the Conservatives, or by any of the other parties?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen is that, I think, as I just mentioned very briefly, the importance of Brexit. So if you ask sort of voters what they think their main priority should be, or what their main priority party should be as we approach the next election, Brexit and the UK-EU relationship has just kind of plummeted in importance. It's been outside of, I think, the top 10 issues on YouGov's issues tracker for quite a long time now. It's nowhere near the importance that it was, even 2-3 years ago. So it's just not an issue that's concerning voters. Instead, what we see is the economy is number 1 pretty consistently, followed by health and now immigration. So I'm not saying that you can untie all those issues from Brexit, from leaving the EU. Obviously, they're all interlinked, but in voters' heads, it's just not a priority at the moment. And so I do genuinely think that this next election campaign will be the first non-Brexit election that we've had since the referendum. Just because it's not, well, firstly, because it's not a priority for voters, as I've just said, and secondly, to come on to that question about parties, it's not particularly in any party's interest to make this an issue. Labour finds it a pretty difficult issue to reckon with because it splits their voter base down the middle. You've got, a lot of Labour voters that were voted Remain in 2016 and want a closer relationship with the EU. At the same time, they want to try and win back the votes in those sort of heavily Leave voting constituencies which may have flipped to the Conservatives for the first time in 2019. So it suits them to keep relatively quiet on this issue, particularly as they're not proposing anything, particularly radical, as I'm sure Jannike can go into more detail on, when it comes to changing the UK-EU relationship in the future. For the Tories, for the reasons I just said, maybe you think they would want to go for it because, go for Brexit. I mean by that, because it would unite that electoral coalition. But realistically, Rishi Sunak could very easily be attacked for taking too sort of weak an approach to the EU from an electorate that very much liked, Boris Johnson's quite irate approach to UK-EU relations. We are seeing a more sort of pragmatic, friendly approach, and that's just not to the tastes of a lot of 2019 Conservative voters, really. So I think it's not going to be an issue because voters aren't really bothered about it at the moment, and it's not really in the party's strategic interests to talk about it very much.
Let's dig down on what are key interests for the electorate. So migration and inflation. So I know that we published our migration report this year, and you should all check it out. It's fantastic. But this year saw the largest net migration on record, about 606,000 people. So what are the key drivers of migration when we're 7 years post-referendum or years after the end of free movement? Stephen, what's sending up those numbers?
Yeah, so what we're seeing with migration and immigration, I guess, in general, is that net migration number of 606 is in large part due to an increase into two areas. And one of those is refugees coming from Ukraine and Hong Kong through the very specific schemes that the UK government has created. Just for numbers, 114,000 of those were from Ukraine, and then 52,000 arrivals were from Hong Kong in 2022. And so that number right there does make up a very high, portion of explains why we're seeing some of those numbers get so high. The other part of that is international student numbers and this has both an effect on this plays both into immigration and also into economy and everything. And so those numbers sometimes can seem incredibly high and a little scary depending on what your views are. But the thing is that for one, those students are usually staying for 2 to 4 years and then leaving. The vast majority of them leave. There is, things that Brexit has brought about, such as the graduate scheme, which allows for students to stay for 2 years after their degree, or up to 3 if they're in their PhD, to work and kind of, get that, provide or give that knowledge that has been created in the UK back into the UK workforce. And so pretty much what we're seeing then is that of the immigration numbers were 925,000. That's immigration only. So not the net migration obviously takes into account those that are leaving the country as well. But of those, 39% were students, 25% were on work visas, 19 on humanitarian routes. And so we're talking, Ukraine and Hong Kong. And only 8% of those were asylum seekers. So 1 in 12 were actually asylum seekers coming in, and 6% were family. And so while the news is very highly focused on small boats and crossings, those are actually make up a very small proportion of the immigration numbers that we are seeing right now.
But let's try and connect it with questions of the economy. Is there any connection between these migration figures and inflation? Or the much easier question, Stephen, why do we have such high inflation?
Yeah, so the very quick answer to that is that no, we from what we see that it is not in relation to immigration as the reasons that we are seeing inflation. It actually could be a very good case could be made that it is very much helping inflation not be worse by actually providing a workforce and not having even higher levels of vacancies within the workforce, which is something that the UK is really struggling with, as we are seeing a very large, what we call the 600,000 missing workers since the pandemic. A lot of this largely due to early retirement. These numbers have hit the UK especially hard, meaning that the numbers of vacancies in the economy are quite high, which can then lead to, if there's a lot of vacancies, you want to keep hold of your workers, which means you're going to kind of raise wages in order to kind of keep them. And so no, immigration is not actually having a negative effect on inflation. Now, to the inflation question in general, I think that one, the answer is that it is difficult. It is hard to kind of piece out everything here, but pretty much what we're seeing is that what's kind of going on with inflation is this is obviously something that is global, something that has been happening to most countries. And this is in large part due to a few different things, but we're talking, kind of coming out of COVID, supply chain demands, and the getting everything moving again. And then obviously one of the biggest ones being the war in Ukraine that have had such an effect on inflation. And so these are obviously issues that are not just happening to the UK. These are things that are affecting all countries in the world. The question then gets into, if we start to kind of dive into those inflation numbers a little bit, why is it that the UK's inflation is now at 8.7%, while we see, for example, kind of looking over the numbers here, the Euro area is at 5.5 in general, with some countries like Switzerland at 1.7, the United States at 4, as well as there is some high ones such as Italy, which is at 6.4, Germany, which is at 6.4. However, still, across the G20, the only countries that have inflation higher than the UK is Turkey and Argentina, which are both in pretty dire circumstances right now, and with inflation much, much higher. And so when we look at that, that's where the story gets a little bit more mixed. And I think that maybe the natural next question is this something to do with Brexit, right? Is inflation have that
exactly
effect? I guess the next question that usually is where it leads is, if it's different in the UK, why? And so I want to be careful to say is that what I think we're seeing is that these very high, this stubborn inflation, these high bills, food costs being inflation within food being at 18%. A lot of this has to do, I think there is cases to be made that there is a Brexit surcharge on top. It is not the main reason. It is not the driving force. It's not like I said, it's very much global, very much happening to all these, but there is little sticking points that are making it a little bit more difficult. And one for that is supply chain and getting those foods. And we've seen that in certain instances where certain products have been in short supply within the UK, this being due to just supply chains being a little bit more difficult. There's more red tape or just non-tariff barriers that are being put in place between our closest neighbors, where we're trading still almost half of our trade being with. And so I not to get too much into or get too bogged down, but we are just seeing that this inflation is being sticky, and that we're still trying to figure out what's that cause, how to kind of address that. That is obviously the big debate right now. And I think a little bit above my pay grade to say that I know all the solutions as to how to fix that.
Well, so one of the questions that has just come up and is sitting in front of me is whether or not Johnny Bairstow's stumping really is in the spirit of cricket. Now, in fear for my job working with Anand Menon and Jill Rudder, I am not going to ask that question because it would be too much of a sticky wicket for me. And instead, let's talk a little bit more about, well, all right, we've talked about the kind of concerns that are going on, especially to do with the electorate, but let's turn a bit more to opportunities, or even the opportunities that came as a result of Brexit. So even with inflation at rising levels, even with record concerns related to migration, Joelle, has the government been able to capitalize? What have we seen in this policy post-Brexit?
Well, first things first, I think the stumping was a bit sort of, not quite within the spirit of the rules, but, these kind of things happen. So probably the England fans need to sort of take it a bit easy as well. But on to Brexit opportunities, I think kind of the key story which needs to be told is one which has changed since the Prime Minister has changed from Boris Johnson to Rishi Sunak, which is that under Johnson, Brexit opportunity were primarily a political sort of regime. And what I mean by that is it was primarily about speaking to certain types of voters. It was about scoring points, whereas under Sunak, I think it's more of a policy-driven regime, which means they're trying more to pursue specific goals. And broadly speaking, I think that is a more sensible way to pursue these kind of Brexit opportunities. So to give you some illustration of what Johnson was doing, we had a long list of 100 pages or so, a document which came out of all the different opportunities which the government wanted to pursue, but there was no real clear sense of what kind of state the UK wanted to be, whether it was trying to be deregulatory, so removing regulation, or whether it was trying to actually be more statist, for example, taking more control of things like subsidies and competition regulation. And no clear direction was ever advanced. And what we ended up with instead was this retained EU law bill, which was the most political of all instruments, because it was primarily a means of saying, look, the civil service is blocking us from deregulating after Brexit. I mean, there are good reasons, I think, why deregulation or changes to regulation have been so hard to pursue, which I think are much deeper. But this was a way of saying civil servants are blocking us. And so what we're going to do instead is let it all expire by default at the end of 2023. And, and that way they'll have to save anything they want to keep. And so that's a way of showing the government seizing control of the narrative and also being able to say, we are going to change 4,000 pieces of retained EU law. It's a good thing you can put on a manifesto. So it's a fundamentally, as I say, political sort of agenda, even though there were sort of almost all what you call stakeholders involved in this said it was a bad way to do policy. It was a bad thing for business, which had no time to prepare. And now under the Sunak government, we've seen that bill be rowed back upon significantly. So this sunset clause at the end of 2023 has been taken out of the bill, and there are far fewer regulations which are going to expire at the end of the year. So Kemi Badenoch has said explicitly, we might need to go slower in order to think about how to do regulation better. And that's now what they're pursuing. And what we're seeing instead, rather than promises of big, grand reform, really doing things differently to the EU, it's a policy which is much more, we want to generally align with EU regulation because that helps our businesses export to the EU. If you have separate rules in the UK and the EU, that makes life more complicated for business. They prefer unified regulations. But what we will do instead is look really in the margins of regulation where there might be niche kind of strategic advantages which really play to the economic characteristics of the UK. And so those are things like early stage AI development. It's how you regulate novel medicines. It's wine production even. It's these kind of, they're not going to fundamentally remake the UK economy, but there might be little sections of strategic advantage. So it's broadly convergence with little bits of divergence. And that's the big shift that we've seen in the past 6 months or so under the Sunak government.
Just on a related note, everyone should check out Joelle's fantastic commentary on what I call big wine. The latest commentary on opportunities in the context of wine in the UK is now on our site. So do check out the commentary. But just pushing a bit further on this, Joelle, what are the big policy potential changes or shifts? Like what should we be looking out for in the next 12 months?
Yeah, so again, I think the key changes, again, like I say, it's where the UK can be perhaps like a different but more complementary partner to the EU. And probably AI is the one that you're going to hear the most talk about. And I think why it's interesting is because it really illustrates the differences in what the UK wants to do compared to the EU, not necessarily being totally apart, but just having different approaches to the same policy issue. So, both can see that AI is dangerous in the sense that we don't quite know what it can do. We don't know the full extent of its powers, and there's no regulation around it because it's a very novel thing. So the EU's approach to that is typical of the way the EU makes law, which is we are going to define every single risk that we can imagine to do with AI. And we are going to say exactly what you may or may not do in relation to that risk and that particular aspect of AI. So that's kind of a real way of trying to take control of all the aspects of AI that you know now. But the problem is the technological field is developing more quickly than the regulation is being pushed through the European institutions, which is why you end up with amendments made a couple of months ago to try and address the fact that we now have ChatGPT and these forms of, God, I've forgotten the word for it, but new forms of AI that basically are trained on a different kind of database and can do much more kind of unpredictable things. And so the EU's regulation can't necessarily keep pace with all these things that are happening. And that's the big risk of the model. Whereas what the UK is saying is we will empower regulators to take decisions for their specific sectors based on overarching guidelines and principles. So it's potentially much more flexible and can move more quickly in response to developments in the field. The danger on the UK side is that you have different regulators pursuing different regulations and they become contradictory, and that it actually becomes very difficult to navigate the UK's regulatory field as a result of that. So you've got two different models. Broadly, both want the same outcomes, which is to have AI being sort of safe for users, offsetting the sort of, the most high risks, whilst also allowing the more innovative, constructive elements, but two different approaches to getting there. And what I think we're going to see is that, rather than them being absolute competitors, you can only do certain types of thing in one and the other. It will be using these kind of international summits to work out how you can align regulation as much as possible, agree on your core principles. The UK is hosting a summit this autumn, which I think is going to be quite about that, especially focused on the future risks of AI in the longer term, not so much the kind of immediate risk we have with the technology now, but the AI that is potentially to come. I think that's what they want to discuss. And so, you potentially have the UK with that slightly more far-sighted vision of future horizons, whereas the EU is really driving forward that regulation, which is about what you can and cannot do with your product, and that the EU and the US are going to drive.
I can remind everyone out there listening that ChatGPT is trained on pre-2021 data, so all of these answers are organic. They have not been written by AI. I can also tell everyone out there on YouTube, apparently we're very popular on YouTube right now, that you should head on over to Slido, where you can ask questions that are appearing before me. I'm glad not to have spotted any more cricket questions, but if anyone else wants to chime in on that sticky wicket of a question, last time I joke about that, please do. But let's push this down, these kind of opportunities or Brexit opportunities, and also looking at the wider scale. Let's talk about trade deals. Where have we got to in trade deals, Stephen?
Yeah, so like Joelle was saying, actually, Kemi Badenoch's idea of kind of slowing down and making sure that things are a little bit better, I think, is actually also in part due to kind of the journey that the UK has had with free trade agreements. Obviously, India is on the docket right now, and I think that is one that they have decided to not push through quickly, but to make sure that it is a thorough free trade agreement and one with actual impact. So far, though, I think that the three big ones that we've seen has been Australia, New Zealand of actual free trade agreements, and then the joining of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. But what we've pretty much seen from these is that these were opportunities for the UK to branch out past what was there. They signed 69 deals with what we call rollover deals. So they're the exact same free trade agreements that the UK had while part of the single market. Australia and New Zealand were the two new ones. And from those, the thing is that what impact that those will have. Free trade agreements take almost a decade to really see the actual results come about from them. This is due to the process of everything within those within a free trade agreement actually being implemented and then incorporated by businesses. It takes them a long time to shift to their supply chains and start to actually move to either exporting more or importing from those countries. And so these are not things that that necessarily constitute a quick win or a quick change within the economy. That being said, what we have seen is that the estimates, the government estimates of the impact of these agreements is quite small. There's this magical 0.08% of GDP, which is the impact that the Australia deal will have, also the impact that joining the CPTPP will have. New Zealand's even smaller at 0.03%. And so what we've seen is that there is actually the economic impact will be quite small of these deals. However, these still are ways for the UK to kind of show that it can create relationships, especially trade relationships outside of the EU. The CPTPP, for example, is one that there is potential for things to kind of grow. They're going to, however, that being said, 11 of the countries that are within the CPTPP, 9 of them, the UK already has a free trade agreement with. And so we're looking at Malaysia and Brunei as being the 2 where we'll actually see quite a significant change in that relationship. Unfortunately, those are both not massive, especially Brunei, but Malaysia will be somewhat of an effect, but we're not looking at something that's going to make a dramatic shift in the way we do it. And that is in large part to kind of what we call the gravity effect, which is that you gravitate towards those that you are nearer to, that pull, that gravitational pull. And in this case, our closest neighbors, the EU, are still going to be the ones that we're going to trade with because we are so close to them. The EU still makes up 50%, or nearly 50% of UK trade. And so relationships with Southeast Asia are great. However, they are still far away, which means that they're not going to be able to just quickly kind of substitute or take over the role of trade that the EU has been for so long in the UK.
Well, celebrating, for those who are celebrating the day that is in it, and happy Independence Day to all the Americans, both speaking on this panel and also out there listening. I can only assume that you are taking time off your day off to listen into us. But how much closer are we to a trade deal with the US? Stephen, as our resident American.
Yes. It is not a very happy 4th of July, I think, for Rishi Sunak or Kemi Badenoch when it comes to a free trade agreement. It is not on the table, and nor will it be on the table for the foreseeable future. The UK was not able to get one under the Trump administration, and it has not been able to get one under the Biden administration, and nor does it look like it. And that is in large part due to what some have called a more protectionist approach to trade. We're seeing that a lot with the Inflation Reduction Act, which I think we're going to get into in a second. But the UK will not has eluded them. It was one of the big promises in the 2019 manifesto was to get that trade deal. However, that looks off the table. What Rishi Sunak was able to do most recently on his trip to Washington was actually get a agreement called the Atlantic Declaration that would start the process of getting a critical minerals agreement, which would allow for the UK to start to benefit from the Inflation Reduction Act by minerals being extracted and processed in the UK to count towards batteries that then have tax credits in the US for EV vehicles or electric vehicles. Sorry. So anyway, not great news on that front.
Let's, because quite a few of our questions from the very prolific Anonymous on Slido are going to the Inflation Reduction Act and the shockwaves that it sends. Stephen, can you explain what the IRA is in As If I'm 5? And
yes,
what's going to be the long-term impact?
Yeah, we pronounce it IRA. That is important to know, to have no other confusion. But yes, the Inflation Reduction Act was a $369 billion dollar subsidy and tax credit act that the US passed recently in order to spur green technology in the US. It looks at everything from semiconductors to batteries to green technologies such as wind and hydropower, all a variety of different things. It covers a lot of the different economies. One of the stickiest points, though, is that the Inflation Reduction Act will affect EV, so electric vehicles, and a lot of the Europe and EU, UK, as well as Japan and Korea and others allies have been very concerned about this due to them feeling that it will disadvantage their markets, that they have trying to grow batteries because they're not going to be eligible for the tax credits because those electric vehicles have to have final assembly within the United States in order to grow kind of the US, made in US sticker type products. And I think Joelle actually, Reland is going to get a little bit more deep into actually what the Inflation Reduction Act is going to do. Yeah.
In fact, taking the lead on that, let's go to Joelle. What was the UK EU response?
Very different between the UK and the EU. I think that's the main headline. And I think it's an interesting debate because this can be seen, depending on your point of view, either as kind of a real sort of Brexit sub-story and the UK kind of being cast adrift, or it can be seen as something that the UK is better off being outside of, because what the EU has done, broadly speaking, is tried to sort of match the US's IRA response. And that means that they've significantly relaxed subsidies regulations. So you've now got much more public money going into investment in green technology. And also they've set targets around domestic manufacturing. So bringing up to 40% of all kind of green manufacturing output inside the EU, which is a massive, massive upscaling in ambition. And this is because they are concerned about businesses moving from Europe over to the United States in order to take advantage of the subsidies on offer in the US, where you need to be based in the US to get those. Yeah, so like I said, for many people, this is a sign that the UK comparatively has done nothing and shows, well, nothing, but, you know, relatively almost nothing. And, you know, that is a sign that outside of the EU, we lack the resources to kind of compete in these kind of subsidy races, and also the ability to attract international investment. Because if you're building, again, your gigafactory, which is to make electric batteries for electric vehicles, you know, as an incentive to be inside the single market, because then you can go and sell more easily into the rest of Europe. And Tesla based its factory in Berlin, you know, not here, even though the UK, I think, was quite interested in that to begin with. But then on the other side, and this is, I should give credit to Peter Jurkovic, one of our fellow researchers who's written about this in more detail. I'm broadly borrowing his argument, but what he said is that some people on the UK side think that this isn't necessarily a particularly smart way to approach competing with the US, and that actually the EU risks slowing down its green transition, because if you have to produce more and more of your solar panels inside the Union, that's actually less efficient than sourcing them from your existing sort of trade links that you have with countries like Japan, say. And so you're effectively, yeah, making it potentially more expensive and slower to produce this stuff, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And there's also the question of energy security, which is that you're trying to do this so that you're less reliant on countries like China for parts that are going into the key technologies of the future. But it's not realistic for the European Union to be able to produce everything within its own sort of boundaries, because they simply don't have all of the minerals, all of the expertise that they need to do all those things in-house. And so what the UK government is arguing is, rather than trying to massively boost investment in pursuit of an energy security strategy, which is ultimately impossible to achieve domestically alone, what you need to do is have more strategic alliances with other countries where you have, say, expertise in the UK in microchip technology or in lithium. There are quite significant lithium resources in the UK, and you can make that your expertise, your strength, and you trade with other countries that have other ones. And that's how you enhance the security of your supplies. And that's how you have a more stable trading future in these green technologies. And that's quite a good argument. But the problem for the UK is that it hasn't actually backed up this argument yet. Because if you're going to do that, you need to invest in your strategic strengths. You need to identify what they are, and you need to put the money in. And we're told that that's coming this autumn, but ultimately we only have the government's word for it at the moment. So there is a case to be made that the UK has a path that it can pursue outside the EU, but we're yet to actually see that deliver in practice. So the jury remains out for the time being, and we probably have to pay attention to what government announces this autumn.
Let's push a parallel thread to this. Let's stick with green strategies. Our audience is asking if you see the EU and UK cooperation on energy, particularly renewable energy, as accelerating into the future. Joelle, let's stick with you on that.
Yeah, I think it probably will. And this comes back to the point I made right at the start with the Windsor framework, is that there is now a recognition that you can be constructive partners. You don't have to be competitors and everything. Divergence isn't only about being better than the EU, about doing things differently. It's now seeing, okay, we have different strategies, but similar interests, and renewable energy is a clear one, where the UK and the EU have similar ambitions to decarbonize. And the obvious example here is the North Seas Energy Cooperation Group, which the UK has now associated to, which is, I think, 8, 9, maybe 10 EU member states and Norway that sort of generally exist around the North Sea. And they want to massively increase their offshore wind capacity, kind of building together. And that, again, is a key part of the UK and EU's transitions to net zero. So that's a really good example of, yes, how, there's much more to be gained from working together than trying to do things apart in that area.
Let's turn now our focus more on that EU-UK relationship and where we've got to. So, Jannike, look at the wider geopolitics of the last 12 months. How has that impacted on the relationship between the UK and the EU?
Sure. Well, I think obviously the geopolitical context that we're in right now is very different to the one when the UK left the EU. So I think that the war in Ukraine has brought into sharp relief that the EU and the UK share the same interests when it comes to the security of the European continent. And we've seen kind of different forms or different expressions of that. So on the EU side, in May this year, we had this op-ed in The Guardian from the 27 EU ambassadors who are based in London, who were basically saying that after Brexit, the EU and the UK have rediscovered each other in their defense of Ukraine and of peace in Europe. And on the UK side, we are equally seeing this realization, which is reflected in the 2023 refresh of the UK Integrated Review, so the review of the UK security, defence, development and foreign policy. The first iteration of that was published in 2021, and the 2021 review made only minimal reference to the EU as a foreign policy partner. But the updated review in 2023, given the geopolitical context, kind of fills this Europe-shaped hole in the review. And the refresh in 2023 is way more explicit in mentioning the Euro-Atlantic as a core area for European security, the EU, and also, for example, the UK's participation in PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation. So we are seeing both sides being more explicit about needing each other as security partners. The 2023 review also commits the UK to supporting the development of the European political community, which is another interesting development which we've seen as a response to the new geopolitical context in Europe in the last 12 months. So the EPC is, of course, this Emmanuel Macron brainchild, and we've seen 2 summits so far, one in Prague last year and one in Moldova just very recently. And there was a bit of a discussion ahead of the summit in Prague whether the UK Prime Minister at the time, Liz Truss, was going to attend or not. And she did attend in the end, and I think this also had a positive impact on EU-UK relations. The EPC is, of course, not an EU-UK forum. It's also not an EU-led forum either. It's an intergovernmental forum. It's a political platform for dialogue, which is attended by more than 40 European heads of state and government. But nevertheless, I think it's shown to be not insignificant for EU-UK relations because the EU and the UK don't at the moment have a joint forum where they can discuss geopolitical challenges. So the EPC forum, what we saw particularly at the summit in Prague, is that the EPC forum allows for informal conversations in the margins. And in Prague, we have seen that the meeting provided not only an opportunity for EU-UK re-engagement, but also particularly for UK-France re-engagement. And after the summit, Macron and Truss released a joint statement saying they would hold a Franco-British summit the first one in 5 years, the first one post-Brexit, which then happened on the 10th of March this year under Rishi Sunak. So I think overall one can say that the geopolitical context has concentrated minds both in the EU and on the UK side as well.
Picking up on a question from our audience here, what kind of opportunities would you see in the EPC?
Well, I mean, I think on the one hand, there is, of course, the opportunity for it to be kind of a bridge between the EU and the UK, and for the UK to again be part of a forum of nation states. And I think in Europe, and I think the big opportunity there is that it is intergovernmental and that it is at the moment not institutionalized. It is not led by the institutions. There's no secretariat or budget at the moment. So what we've seen throughout the Brexit negotiations was that the UK was not interested in a more structured or institutionalized security partnership with the EU. There was actually a text on the table, and that was part of the political declaration where both sides had committed to having a more structured dialogue on security and foreign policy. But then when Boris Johnson came in as Prime Minister, it became increasingly clear that this was not something that the UK wanted. So this then didn't become part of the TCA. And this is something that maybe if there is a Labour government, they might be more interested in and they've been talking about. But for the time being, there is no such forum. So I think in that way, it is an opportunity for EU-UK relations, but obviously also for Europe as a whole. This is an important historic moment, kind of the geopolitical awakening of Europe as a continent, and for heads of states to come together and discuss regularly, I think is going to be important. But there are lots of question marks about the EPC's future and whether it's actually going to remain relevant. We know that there are 2 more summits ahead of us, one in Granada in Spain in October, and then one in the UK next year, which is going to be interesting to see how the UK wants to shape that. But after that, I think it remains to be seen what happens with the geopolitical context in Europe, whether this forum will actually remain relevant or not.
Let's focus on the bilateral relationship between the UK and the EU. Of course, the most significant moment for the thawing, if not the warming of relations, was the Windsor Framework. But Jannike, sticking with you, how has that relationship evolved over the course of the last 12 months?
Yeah, I think politically the relationship is in a much better place than it was 12 months ago. I mean, if we look back a year ago, political tensions were still running really high. If you look at headlines in the Financial Times a year ago, those were basically saying Germany and Ireland accused the UK of not acting in good faith over Northern Ireland, UK ministers to tear up post-Brexit trade deal, Liz Truss considers triggering Article 16 over Northern Ireland Protocol. So we can certainly say that we have moved on from talk about tearing up the deal, trade wars, bad faith. And the main catalyst, as you say, for this change has been the Windsor Framework, which both sides announced in February this year and then adopted in March. And since the Windsor Framework, there has been a lot of talk about reset and normalization of the relationship. But I think the important question to ask in this context is, what does normalization mean? Because I think normalization means for the UK that we are now a normal third country, and there might no longer be the threat of a trade war, but that doesn't mean that from now on everything is going to be smooth sailing in the relationship. I think one example for that that has had a lot of media attention as well is the UK's associate membership of Horizon, the EU's research and innovation programme. So after the adoption of the Windsor Framework, there was the expectation that everything else would somehow fall into place. And Ursula von der Leyen in the press conference even said, "Oh, this is good news for all of those working in research and science." So the expectations were high, but what we've seen then in reality is that there have been protracted negotiations over the size of the UK's contribution, the UK saying we want to see value for money, and then actually not being as easy as anticipated, even though this is an area where both sides have clear interests. So I guess overall, whilst agreeing the Windsor framework was necessary, it was still not a sufficient condition to realizing the full potential of the TCA, and it very much remains a live agreement with lots of inbuilt grace periods, lots of inbuilt review clauses, which can still cause tensions in the future. So the Windsor framework, definitely very positive step, but relations outside between the EU and the UK and for the UK as a third country are still going to be tricky from time to time.
Let's pick up on this. Joelle, what's your take on the UK political attitudes towards the EU relationship, and maybe even looking forward, what's going to be very important in the next 12 months when it comes to that relationship?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with what Jannike is saying about we're still in the baby steps and all these other things haven't really fallen into place. And I think just building on that, and this, I think what is most significant actually about the way the Sunak government is approaching relations is they seem to be finding it easier to construct relations which exist outside of that treaty framework rather than within. So you've had the Horizon issue, you've also got the grace periods around electric vehicles where they've still not managed to find an extension, even though it would be in both sides' interest, probably. It's slightly murky as to why, but when you're having to negotiate within a treaty, it's still quite difficult. Whereas where have we seen development like that North Seas group, like now this agreement to do more on Frontex, which is to do with immigration agencies, security agencies. So this PESCO agreement on foreign security policy, this is all slightly more ad hoc outside of the treaty stuff. And I think generally that's quite how the UK likes to operate. It's like how it likes to do its foreign policy. It's less bound in to formal obligations. And so that maybe is an indicator of if we're going to see progress and development, where it's most likely to come. It's where it's in that slightly more ad hoc instrumentalized way of approaching policy problems. I think that would change if we saw a Labour government, which very clearly, rhetorically speaking, doesn't make sense. While it doesn't want to sort of renegotiate the fundamentals of the relationship, it's still quite happy with having this the principles of the TCA, where we're not in the customs union, single market, etc. I think would look to do more within the treaty and think about how you can add on and develop it to minimize some of the trade barriers which have been created, especially to do with imports and exports and the new bureaucracy that's there. They want things like an SPS agreement, mutual recognition of professional qualifications, things like that. But the thing Labour needs to think about, or potentially another government if they were so minded to pursue that kind of cooperation, is it's not just a case of the UK asking and the UK getting. I think there is extreme Brexit fatigue in the European Union. They had a lot of years of dealing with this stuff, occupying so much of their bandwidth, and now they're not really thinking about it very much at all. They've moved on and they have other priorities, which are about strategic autonomy. It's about all these questions of responding to the IRA, energy security, and so forth. And therefore, the incentive on the EU side has to be very, very strong for them to come back to the table and say, look, we're going to add new chapters into the TCA. We're going to give you these agreements. And just very quickly, I think what the incentives would have to be is the UK needs to demonstrate that it's a trusted partner where, if it's going to sign up to SPS standards, that it's going to commit to those standards, act on them in good faith, which the UK hasn't necessarily always done in the past few years. And that would happen regardless of who's in power, which is a very, very high bar to begin with. And also, the UK might have to offer something in return. It can't just all be about what it takes, but it has to give something. That might be about mobility. That might be about allowing more European Union students to come and study here more easily, workers to come and work here more easily. I don't know, but it's a two-way conversation. I think that's what's often forgotten when we talk about the future of the relationship.
Well, I mean, the obvious next question to both of you, as you're going to be leading our work on this, is, well, TCA review, is this going to be the answer to all of our concerns, questions, hopes, and dreams? So, Jannike, let's go to you first.
I think Joelle already kind of alluded to it. I think there has been a lot of talk about the TCA review and what it might look like and what the UK might want to achieve with it. on the UK side in the past few weeks and months. I think it's important to think about what the EU's perspective on this is. And I think, first of all, before focusing on the review, what the EU wants to see is the proper implementation of all aspects of the agreements. And that is the TCA, but also particularly the Windsor framework. So we already alluded to that earlier today. I think then, second of all, the EU has been pretty clear that they see the TCA as a good agreement that works for them. So as Joelle says, what is the incentive for the EU to conduct this review in a way that is not just a very narrow technical exercise that reviews the implementation, which is what they are obliged to according to the TCA, because the TCA says this is a review of the implementation. It is not a renegotiation of the TCA, and there's also no obligation to produce results. So if that's something that the UK wants, then they have to think about what is the incentive for the EU to move into that direction. And then I also think that it's important to understand that for the EU, the relationship is no longer a priority. So this really has been relegated to a third order issue that is no longer central to the EU's thinking about the future. And I think it was quite telling, Stefan Führing at his last kind of public appearance, when he was saying, oh, the EU will spend more time thinking about future members than a past member. So I think this is really where the EU side is coming from. So what do we know about the TCA review at the moment? We know it's a review of the implementation. We know it will take place in 2026. And we know that the TCA is not very prescriptive in terms of how to conduct this review. So it will be up to both sides to come together. But yeah, I guess for the UK, as we said, they will have to think about what's the incentive, how can we build trust, how can we make this worthwhile for the EU so that they're even interested in looking into it.
A question from David Ellen Green, and our most popular question is, what would a more substantial association agreement between the UK and the EU look like? What could it have that is not currently in the TCA? Wrapping this up with our question about review. Joelle, answer that incredibly straightforward question.
Okay, bearing in mind time is running out, I mean, slightly flippantly, I would say just read any David Lammy speech. Like broadly speaking, Labour has listed all the things that, you know, could be done to improve the sort of structure of the trading relationship without renegotiating the fundamentals. So I think, I don't mean to be rude to the question, but I think they're sort of, they are there. We, broadly speaking, know what they are because they're finite. And I think the more important question is how you get there. It's the politics of it. I think that's where more thinking still needs to be done. And, you know, I can refer back to my previous answer for that. I would just add the TCA review. Yes, the EU is very much doing this expectation management. It's a narrow technical exercise. It doesn't prescribe any formal revision. You know, I think that's them trying to shape the conversation. I don't think that's necessarily their final position. And if a future government wants to try and see these like changes, additions to the TCA as it currently exists, they will need a political moment. It can't just be done through lots of officials sort of working away and all the little nuances. They need to have high level agreement. And that's how things move. That's how the Windsor Framework moved. That's how the Northern Ireland Protocol even came to be in the first place. And the TCA review could be a moment. It doesn't have to be, but it is a potential, you know, place for a summit, because something like that needs to be, I think, where those conversations start to flow from.
So in our last couple of minutes, let's think about the next 12 months. First, Jannike, give us highlights of what are the big issues for the EU.
Okay, trying to be very quick. I think there's going to be lots of key issues for the EU over the 12 months, but one kind of broader point with the view to the EU's future is going to be the enlargement process, because Ukraine has given new impetus to the enlargement process. So we saw last year in June, the European Council granted candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova, and also confirmed Georgia's European perspective. So that means with those countries and the Western Balkans, the EU of 27 could grow to an EU of 36. And I think there are lots and lots of questions around that for the EU, not just whether those countries are ready to join the EU, but whether the EU itself is ready to integrate those countries and make sure it's still able to make decisions and act. So those are questions around the size of the Commission, the size of the Parliament, veto power, decision-making processes. Lots of the net beneficiaries of the EU budget are going to become net contributors. So how are you going to manage all of that? So I think that's going to be a very important topic for the EU in the next 12 months, but also beyond.
Of course, the fastest way to get the research team excited is to talk about the fact that we have a general election next year. You can see all their excited faces right now. Sophie, take us through it. What can we expect in a year of a general election?
I don't think anyone gets quite as excited as I do, to be fair. I think I'm in charge, like hyping up the research team for the next general election. I think a general election year is always a weird one because, you're in a kind of lamed up parliamentary year in a lot of ways, and that there could be a new government in place in a few months' time that is going to unpick everything that is currently going through. So that's one sort of weird thing to look out for, I think. I think in terms of, when we're looking at terms of what is the next outcome of the election going to be, the by-elections that I talked about before are going to be important, particularly because I think even though Labour are, ahead in the polls, it will be interesting to kind of see, it feels like the sentiment at the minute amongst voters is very anti-Conservative, but not necessarily pro-Labour. I don't think it's a given that there's going to be this shift of electoral support in such a straightforward way. So how that splinters amongst smaller parties like the Lib Dems, like the Greens, Reform, where they stand, and just not voting at all, which is something that I think people forget about, is how important turnout is actually going to be in the next election as well. How that all kind of translates will be quite interesting, and those by-elections will give us an idea of where that support goes, particularly in very traditional Conservative safe seats. Even if those seats aren't lost, if the vote share goes down, how that happens will be quite interesting to look at. I think the other thing to consider ahead of the next general election is Scotland. A lot of these Scottish seats, because of the ongoing situation with the SNP, the resignation of Nicola Sturgeon, it will be interesting to see how they're kind of up for grabs for the first time in, since 2015, essentially. And kind of, does that bring Labour closer to a potential majority? How far is SNP support going to be depleted in those seats? I think that will be quite an important electoral story over the next 12 months.
So final question to everyone, and putting it on permanent record because we're going to be recorded and put on YouTube. What's everyone's prediction for the general election? Joelle, let's start with you.
Well, what I said before was Labour will get a majority of 1, so I'm going to stick with that just for maximum drama.
Stephen, you sticking with the drama, or are you going to give a different guess?
No, I'll be more optimistic. I think a majority of 3 seats.
Jannike, any shift on a majority of 3 to Labour?
I would also say a small Labour majority, or for dramatic effect, a hung parliament.
As a constitutionalist and a legal academic, that's something that's quite exciting to me, but quoting a dear friend, the Constitution should never be exciting. Sophie, as our expert on public opinion and politics, what's your guess?
I mean, I do think a majority of 1 is potentially the most Labour result to ever happen in an election, but I'm going to say 25 majority.
On that set of predictions from our fantastic research team, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today at our very first Ask the Experts Lunch Hour. This is also going to be our final lunch hour of the summer, where we take a long-deserved break and hopefully some leave from the dramatic events and happenings that has been this year in the UK. I'd like to remind everyone out there listening that we have another event coming up on the 19th of July. That's in Blackford. You can sign up on our website. And there is nothing left for me to do except to thank again our wonderful research team and remind them how much of a privilege it is for me to work with you. So wishing everyone a lovely afternoon. Hopefully the weather improves. And